My name doesn't really matter for the story, and I think that's the first honest thing I can say. For most of my life, I carried a name that felt like a coat someone else had picked out for me, a coat I wore because it fit the shape people expected, not because it kept me warm. I want to tell you what it was like to live inside that coat for 32 years, and what happened when the person who knew me best in the world quietly, patiently, and without any of the drama you might expect, helped me try on something that fit. This isn't a story about shock. It isn't a story about a secret discovered in a closet or a confrontation in a hallway. It's slower than that, and I think, if you let it be, kinder than that too. It's the story of how my wife turned me into her dream girl, and then, 6 years later, married me again in a small courthouse ceremony where the only guests were her mother, my sister, and a notary public who kept losing her pen. But to get there, I have to start much earlier, in a small house in a small town where the wallpaper in the hallway had a pattern of tiny yellow ducks, and where I first understood, without having any of the words for it, that something about me was going to be complicated for a very long time. I was 6 years old the first time I understood there were rules I hadn't been given a copy of. My cousin Marissa was staying with us for the summer, and she had brought a suitcase full of the kind of things I had only ever seen from a distance. There were dresses folded like pastries, a small pink hairbrush with a broken handle, a necklace of plastic pearls she wore only on Sundays. I remember standing in the doorway of the guest room, watching her comb her hair in the mirror, and feeling something I didn't yet know how to name. It wasn't envy exactly, and it wasn't longing in the shape adults use that word. It was more like recognition, the way you feel when you hear a song you've never heard before, but somehow already know the next line. Marissa saw me watching and, being 9, and therefore infinitely wise, held out the brush. "Do you want to try?" she asked, and I said no because I already understood, without being told, that the answer was supposed to be no. That was the first lie I ever told myself, and I told it so smoothly that I didn't even notice I was lying. I would spend the next 26 years perfecting that particular skill. My father was not a cruel man. I want to say that clearly because it would be easier, in a story like this, to give you a villain in the shape of a father, and the truth is more ordinary, and therefore more painful. He was a quiet man who worked at a lumberyard and came home smelling of sawdust and coffee, and he loved me in the way men of his generation had been taught to love their sons, which is to say from a careful distance, with hands on shoulders instead of hugs, with lessons about tools and cars, and how to shake hands firmly. He wasn't watching me for signs of anything. He was just being who he was and expecting me to be who he assumed I was. That expectation was heavier than any rule he could have spoken out loud. My mother was warmer, but she was also tired, working 2 jobs while my father's back healed from an injury that took nearly 2 years to mend, and I learned early not to bring her anything that might complicate her already complicated day. So when the feelings came, and they came often, I learned to keep them in the small internal room I was already building, a room with no windows and a door that locked from the outside. By the time I was 10, I had a system. I would wait until the house was empty, which happened on Thursday afternoons when my mother had her long shift, and my father took my younger brother to physical therapy for a knee he had hurt playing football. I would go into my mother's closet, and I would not touch anything because touching felt like theft, and theft felt like proof of something I wasn't ready to prove. Instead, I would just stand there, breathing in the smell of her perfume and the dry cleaning bags, and I would let myself imagine, just for a few minutes, what it might feel like to belong in a room like that. Then I would close the door, go to my own room, and do my math homework, and by dinner I would be the boy everyone expected, quiet at the table, polite when spoken to, invisible in the way that felt safest. I want to be careful here because I know how these stories can slide into a kind of self-pity that isn't useful to anyone. I wasn't a tragic child. I had friends, I had a dog named Butter who slept on my feet, I had a bicycle I loved, and a treehouse my father built me the summer his back finally healed. My childhood was not stolen from me. It was just that a part of me lived inside a room no one else could see, and that part of me was very lonely, and I didn't yet understand that loneliness was a signal, not a personality. Adolescence made everything louder. When you're a child, the gap between who you are and who you're being can feel like a game, something you can look away from. When your body starts changing in ways that feel like a decision being made without your consent, the gap becomes a canyon. I remember being 14 and looking in the bathroom mirror after a shower and not recognizing the person looking back at me. I don't mean that in the poetic sense. I mean I would stare at my own reflection and feel a low, humming panic because the face was becoming something I hadn't agreed to.
My jaw was widening.
My voice had cracked and settled somewhere lower than I wanted it to be. Hair was appearing in places I hadn't given it permission to appear. I would stand there with a towel around my waist and think, this isn't right, this isn't right, this isn't right. And then I would put on my clothes and go to school, and no one would know that I had spent 7 minutes at war with a mirror. I told no one. I did not have the language. This was before the internet had become the kind of place a scared kid could find a map, and the only representations I had ever seen of people like me were cruel jokes on late-night television, punchlines in movies my uncles laughed at loudly. So I concluded, with the airtight logic of a lonely teenager, that whatever I was must be shameful, because shame was the only response the world seemed to have prepared for it. I coped the way a lot of us cope. I threw myself into things that would make me look, from the outside, like exactly the person people expected. I joined the wrestling team, not because I liked wrestling but because it seemed like the kind of thing that would end any conversation about who I might really be. I dated a girl named Jennifer in 10th grade because she was kind and patient and asked very little of me, and I broke up with her in 11th grade because I could feel her starting to want the kind of intimacy I didn't know how to give without lying with my whole body. I got good grades because good grades were a shield. I stayed late at school for clubs I didn't care about because home, with its mirrors and its silences, was harder than staying. And every once in a while, maybe 2 or 3 times a year, when the pressure of holding it all in became more than I could bear, I would drive to a drugstore in the next town over and buy a lipstick, and I would put it on in the parking lot behind the store where no one could see me, and I would look at myself in the rearview mirror and cry for reasons I couldn't have explained even to myself. And then I would wipe it off with a napkin from the glove compartment and drive home and eat dinner with my family as if nothing had happened. I threw the lipsticks away afterward. Every time. I must have thrown away 30 lipsticks between the ages of 15 and 19. I think about that sometimes. All that waste, all that hiding, all that grief compressed into small tubes of color left in gas station trash cans across 3 counties. I met the woman who would become my wife in the second week of my sophomore year of college. Her name is Elena, and I want to describe her to you the way I saw her that first day, because I think it matters. She was sitting on a low brick wall outside the philosophy building, reading a book with a cracked spine, and her hair was doing that thing where it fell across her face, and she kept tucking it behind her ear only for it to fall back again. She was wearing a green sweater that was too big for her, and later I would learn it had belonged to her older brother who had died when she was 17, and she wore it because it was the only piece of him she had that still held any warmth. But that first day, I didn't know any of that. I just knew that she looked up when I walked past and smiled at me the way you smile at a stranger you're pretty sure you're going to know for a long time. We ended up in the same seminar on ethics, and by the 3rd class she had started saving me a seat, and by the 6th class I had started bringing her coffee, and by the end of the semester we were the kind of friends who could sit in silence together for an hour and not need to fill it. I didn't tell her about the room inside me, not for a long time, but she knew something. I could feel her knowing, the way you feel weather changing before it changes. We started dating in the spring of my junior year, and I want to be honest about the fear I carried in those early months. I loved her. I loved her the way you love the first person who makes you feel seen without asking you to explain yourself. And I was terrified, because I knew that loving her honestly would eventually require me to open the door to that internal room, and I didn't know if the room would still be there when I looked, or if it would be empty, or if it would be full of something that would drive her away. So, I did what I had been doing my whole life. I performed. I was the boyfriend she deserved on paper, attentive and thoughtful and steady, and I hid the parts of me that didn't fit that performance in the same locked place I had always hidden them. But hiding is exhausting, and love makes hiding harder. Because love wants to be witnessed, and a witness can't see you if you're standing in the dark. I began to have dreams, vivid and specific, in which I would be walking down a street in a dress, and Elena would come around a corner and see me, and in some dreams she would smile, and in other dreams she would turn and walk away, and I would wake up not knowing which dream I was more afraid of. The first time I told her, I was 24 years old, and we had been married for 8 months. We were sitting on the floor of our first apartment, a tiny place above a Vietnamese restaurant where the smell of pho drifted up through the floorboards every evening around 6. We had been eating cheap wine and cheaper pasta, and she had been telling me about a patient at the clinic where she worked as a therapist in training, a woman who had spent 30 years afraid to tell her husband that she wanted to go back to school. Elena said very quietly, "Isn't it strange how much of our lives we spend afraid of the people who love us most?" And something in me, some hinge that had been rusting shut for 2 decades, gave way. I put down my wine glass and I said her name, and I said, "I have to tell you something, and I've been afraid to tell you for a long time, and if it changes things I understand, but I can't keep carrying it alone."
She didn't say anything.
She just moved closer and she took my hand and she waited. And I told her, not everything, not all at once, because I didn't have the words for all of it yet. But I told her about the closet when I was 10. I told her about the lipsticks in the parking lot. I told her about the mirror and the panic and the room inside me with the locked door. And I watched her face for the thing I had been afraid of my whole life, and I did not find it. What I found instead was a stillness, and then, slowly, tears, and then she said, "Thank you for telling me, and I've been waiting for you to be ready." I want to pause here because I know how this might sound. I know how easy it would be to make Elena into a saint in this story, and to make her acceptance into a kind of miracle. But that isn't fair to her, and it isn't fair to what actually happened. She wasn't a saint. She was a person who had done her own work, and who had guessed at parts of me long before I told her, and who had made a decision, quietly and on her own, that whoever I turned out to be would be someone she wanted to know. That isn't magic. That's love as a discipline. That's love as a series of small, unglamorous choices to stay curious about the person in front of you. And I want to say, for anyone listening who has been afraid to tell the people they love the truth about themselves, that there are more Elenas in the world than you might think.
Not everyone now.
Not always. But more than the fear tells you. The fear is a liar with a very loud voice, and it has been rehearsing its script since you were a child, and it will do everything it can to keep you from finding out that some of the people around you have been waiting, quietly, for you to be ready. That night, after we had cried and eaten cold pasta and cried some more, Elena asked me a question I had never been asked before, and I had certainly never asked myself. She said, "What do you want? Not what are you, not what does this mean, not what are we going to do. Just, what do you want?" And I realized, sitting there on the floor of our little apartment with the smell of pho coming up through the boards, that I had never once in my life allowed myself to answer that question honestly. I had spent 30 years managing other people's expectations of me, and the machinery of that management had become so automatic that I no longer knew where the machinery ended, and I began. I said, "I don't know." I said, "I don't even know how to know." And she said, "Okay, then let's figure out how to know." And that was the beginning of the second half of my life. We started slowly. This is the part of the story that a lot of people misunderstand, because they expect the discovery of an identity to look like a lightning strike, a single dramatic moment of before and after. It wasn't like that. It was more like learning a language you had heard in the background your whole life without knowing anyone was speaking it directly to you. Elena suggested, gently, that we try one small thing. Not everything at once. Not a declaration to the world. Just one small experiment at home, with the doors locked and the shades drawn, not because there was anything to hide, but because we wanted the space to be private and unhurried. She had a friend who worked in theatrical makeup, and she asked this friend, without giving names, to teach her a few basics. And one Saturday afternoon, about 3 weeks after the night on the apartment floor, she sat me down on a stool in our bathroom, and she said, "If you want, we can just try. And if at any point you want to stop, we stop. And if at the end you look in the mirror, and it isn't what you wanted, we wipe it off and we make dinner, and we never speak of it again unless you want to." And I said, okay. I want to tell you what that afternoon felt like, but I'm not sure I have the words, and I've been trying to find them for 8 years. It wasn't erotic. It wasn't a fantasy fulfilled. It was quieter than that and much more disorienting. It felt like coming home to a house you had only ever seen in dreams. She worked slowly, and she talked the whole time, narrating what she was doing in a low, calm voice, the way you talk to a horse that's spooked, and every few minutes she would ask if I was okay, and I would nod because I didn't trust my voice. And when she was finished, she turned the stool around so I could see the mirror, and I looked at the face in the glass. And for the first time in my life, I did not want to look away. I did not recognize the person looking back at me, but I recognized something, some low humming rightness that I had felt only in fragments before, in the doorway of the guest room when I was 6, in the parking lot with the lipstick when I was 16, in the seconds after Elena had said thank you for telling me. And I started to cry, and Elena started to cry, and we sat in the bathroom for a long time and didn't say anything at all, and I understood, in a way I had never understood before, that I had been in mourning my whole life for a person I had never been allowed to meet. The months after that afternoon were not easy. I want to be clear about that too, because I don't want anyone listening to think that recognition solves everything. Recognition is a beginning, not an ending. What followed was a long and often confusing process of figuring out what any of it meant, and whether it meant something big or something small, and whether the words that other people used for experiences like mine were words that fit me or words I was just borrowing, because they were the only words available. I read a lot. I read memoirs and clinical papers and message boards and old letters between friends. I saw a therapist, a woman named Dr. Amati, who had been recommended by a colleague of Elena's, and I spent a year in her office learning how to tell the difference between the voice of my own longing and the voice of my father in my head, which had become so tangled together over the decades that I could no longer tell which was which. I was not immediately sure that I was a woman. I was not immediately sure that I wasn't. I was sure of very little, actually, except that the small room inside me was no longer locked, and that whatever was in there, I wanted to know it. Elena went to therapy too on her own because she said that whatever was happening to me was also happening to her, and she wanted to make sure she was showing up for both of us as honestly as she could. She talked to her therapist about grief because she said that even though she loved me and wanted me to become whoever I was becoming, there was a version of our life that she had imagined, and that version was quietly going away, and she needed a place to mourn it that wasn't in front of me. I think about that a lot. I think about how much emotional work she did in rooms I never saw, so that when she came home to me, she could be fully present without asking me to carry her processing on top of my own. Not everyone gets that kind of partnership. I know how lucky I am. I also know that Elena would say, and has said, that she got things from me too, that watching me become myself changed her ideas about her own permission to change, and that we have been each other's teachers in ways that neither of us expected when we were 20 and reading philosophy on a brick wall. Telling the rest of my family was harder. My mother was the first because I had always been closer to her, and because I knew that if I told her first she would help me figure out how to tell my father. I drove to her house on a Sunday afternoon, and I sat at her kitchen table where I had eaten 10,000 meals, and I told her, and she was quiet for a long time. She got up and made tea, which was what she always did when she needed to think, and she brought 2 cups back to the table, and she sat down and she said, "I always wondered." That was all. I always wondered. And then she said, "I love you, and I'm scared for you, and I don't know how to help, and I want to try." And I understood, sitting there, that her love had been larger than her understanding my whole life, and that this was true of most parents who love their children, and that the work of a good adult child is sometimes to give your parents the chance to be larger than they thought they could be. She and I cried together for a while, and then we talked about my father, and she said, "I'll tell him with you if you want, or I'll tell him first if you want, but you should know that he is going to need time, and time is not the same as rejection, and I need you to try to remember that." My father needed time. He needed more time than I wanted him to need, and I want to be honest about how painful that was, because I don't want anyone listening to think that acceptance is always instant when it comes, or that a slow acceptance is the same as a failure of love. When my mother and I told him, in the living room of the house I had grown up in, sitting on the same couch where I had watched cartoons on Saturday mornings, he did not cry, and he did not shout. He sat very still, and he looked at his hands, and he said, "I need to think about this." And he got up and he put on his coat and he went out to the garage, and he stayed there for 4 hours. I sat with my mother in the living room, and she held my hand, and neither of us said anything, and I could feel the whole story of my childhood running through me like a river, all the Thursday afternoons in the closet, all the lipsticks in the parking lots, all the years of being the son he thought he had, and I felt, for the first time since Elena had said thank you for telling me, a kind of despair that I did not know how to name. When he came back inside, his eyes were red, and he sat down across from me, and he said, "I love you. I don't understand this. I am going to try to understand this. I need you to be patient with me because I am an old man and I was taught things I am going to have to unlearn, and unlearning is slower than learning. Can you be patient with me? And I said yes. And I meant it. And it took him 2 years to be able to use my new name without stumbling, and it took him 3 years to be able to hug me the way he had never hugged me when I was a boy, and I want to tell you that when he finally did, on my 30th birthday, in the driveway of his house with the light coming through the trees the way it had come through the trees my whole life, I understood that his slowness had not been rejection. It had been the exact opposite. It had been him refusing to say things he didn't yet mean, because he loved me enough to want his acceptance to be real when it arrived. Not everyone in my life stayed. I want to be honest about that too, because a lot of stories like this one skip over the losses, and I think the losses are important to name. I had a friend from college, a man I had known for 12 years, who told me after I came out to him that he needed to step back, and step back turned out to mean disappear. I had a cousin who stopped inviting me to her children's birthdays, and who told a mutual family member that she was concerned about the influence I might have. I had a coworker, someone I had considered a friend, who filed a complaint against me at work that was so vague and yet so poisonous that I ended up leaving that job 6 months later, not because the company failed me, but because the daily weight of being watched by someone who had decided I was a threat became more than I could carry. Those losses hurt. They still hurt, honestly. There is a particular grief that comes from realizing that someone's affection for you is contingent on you being a version of yourself that wasn't real, and that grief doesn't go away just because you've made peace with who you actually are. What I have learned is that you can hold that grief without letting it become bitterness, and that the space left by people who leave is often, eventually, filled by people who arrive, and the people who arrive tend to be lighter to carry, because they came for who you actually are rather than for a costume you were wearing. I want to talk about the mental health piece of this because I think it's the part that gets left out of a lot of stories like mine, and I think leaving it out does a disservice to anyone who might be walking a similar road. There were months, especially in the first 2 years after I came out to Elena, when I was not okay. I don't mean I was struggling, in the polite way we say struggling when we mean sad. I mean, I was in a kind of pain that I had not known was possible because the walls I had built to protect myself as a child were coming down, and everything I had used those walls to hold back was coming with them. I had panic attacks in grocery stores. I had nights when I couldn't sleep and nights when I couldn't stop sleeping. I had a period of about 4 months when I could not look at photographs of myself from before, not because I hated who I had been, but because I grieved for how alone she had been, and grief that old and that concentrated is not something you can just feel and move through in an afternoon. I want to say clearly that I would not have gotten through those months without help. I saw Dr. Mahdi every week. I took medication for a period of time, which is not a shameful thing to say, and which I mention because I know how many people have been taught to think it is. I called a crisis line twice, both times in the middle of the night, both times because I did not trust myself to be alone with my own thoughts, and both times the person on the other end of the line was kind and steady, and reminded me that I did not have to solve everything by morning. If you are listening to this and you are in that kind of pain, I want you to hear me. Please tell someone. Please call someone. The pain is not proof that you are wrong about who you are. The pain is proof that you have been carrying too much for too long and that you need help setting some of it down, and there is no shame in needing that help. There is no version of strength that requires you to drown quietly. That isn't strength. That's just drowning. Elena and I decided about 3 years into the process that we wanted to renew our vows. This was her idea, not mine, and I want to be careful about how I describe it because it can sound in the retelling like a grand gesture, and it wasn't. It was quieter than that. She said one night that she had married a person she loved and that she was still married to a person she loved, and that in between those two statements there had been so much change and so much growth that she wanted to mark it somehow. She said she didn't want a big ceremony. She didn't want to make a spectacle of my identity or her acceptance. She just wanted to stand in front of someone official and say the words again and have a piece of paper that reflected who we both were now. So we went to the courthouse on a Tuesday morning in October, and her mother came, and my sister came, and the notary kept losing her pen, and we said the words, and I wore a simple gray dress that Elena had helped me pick out the week before, and she wore the same green sweater she had been wearing the day I met her because her brother would have wanted to be there, and this was the closest she could get. And when we left the courthouse and walked out into the light, I realized that I had been married twice to the same person and that both marriages had been real, and that the second one was not a replacement for the first, but a continuation of it. The way a river is not a different river when it bends around a mountain, but still the same water finding its way. I want to say something now to anyone who is watching this and who has been in the position of loving someone who is going through what I went through. Elena would want me to say this because she said it to me once, and I have thought about it many times since. She said that the hardest part for her in the early days was the sense that she was supposed to have all the right answers and all the right feelings, and that any moment of confusion or grief on her part would be a failure of love. And she said that what she had to learn was that love is not the absence of complicated feelings. Love is what you do with the complicated feelings. Love is choosing over and over to stay curious about the person in front of you, even when the person in front of you is changing in ways you didn't expect. And she said that partners of people like me often carry a lot of guilt about their own hard days, and that they shouldn't because their hard days are part of the process too. And hiding those days doesn't make anyone stronger. It just makes everyone more alone. If you're the partner or the parent or the friend or the child of someone who is going through something like this, I want you to know that your feelings are also allowed to be complicated. Get your own support. Talk to your own therapist. Journal, cry, go for long walks, call your sister, do whatever you need to do to process what you are processing. You are not required to be a saint. You are only required to keep showing up honestly, and honesty includes the hard parts. There is a question I get asked a lot now from friends and from strangers and sometimes from myself, and the question is whether I would go back and change things if I could. Whether I would have known sooner, come out sooner, spared myself the decades of hiding. And I've thought about this question for a long time, and I have arrived at an answer that surprises me every time I say it. I don't think I would change it. I don't say that because I think suffering is noble or because I want to romanticize what those years cost me. I say it because the person I am now was made by all of it, and I don't know how to want the destination without also wanting the road that led there. The child in the closet doorway, the teenager crying in the parking lot, the young man who could not look at himself in the mirror after a shower, the husband on the floor of the apartment above the Vietnamese restaurant. All of them are still inside me, and they are not embarrassments to be hidden. They are witnesses. They are the ones who kept me alive long enough to become the person who could finally meet them. When I say their names to myself, I say them with tenderness because they did their best with what they had, and what they had was very little, and they got me here, and here is a good place to be. I want to close by talking about the ordinary parts of my life now, because I think the ordinary parts are the parts that matter most, and they're the parts that stories like this one usually leave out. I get up in the morning, and I make coffee. I go to work, which is a job I like, at a company that does not care about anything except whether I do my job well, and I do my job well, and I have friends there who ask about my weekend, and I ask about theirs. I go to the grocery store, and sometimes I run into people I knew before, and some of them are awkward, and some of them are kind, and one of them, a woman I hadn't seen in 15 years, cried in the produce section and told me she had always suspected and was glad I was happy. I have a dog now, a small brown one named Pickle, who has strong opinions about the mail carrier. Elena and I are talking about maybe adopting a child in the next few years, or maybe not. We're not sure yet, and the uncertainty feels okay, because we have learned that we can hold uncertainty together without it becoming a wound. I go to therapy once a month now instead of once a week, which is a milestone I am proud of. I call my father every Sunday, and he calls me by my name, and he asks about my work and my dog and my garden, and sometimes when we hang up I sit for a minute and feel amazed that this is my life. The girl in Marissa's guest room doorway did not know that any of this was possible. The teenager in the drugstore parking lot did not know. The husband on the apartment floor did not know. If any of them could see me now, I don't think they would recognize me, but I think they would recognize the feeling I have when I look in the mirror in the morning, which is the same feeling they had in their brief, stolen moments of rightness. Only now it is not stolen, and it is not brief. It is just my life. It is the ordinary miracle of getting to be the person I always was, in the daylight, without hiding, without apologizing, without asking anyone's permission except my own and the permission of the woman I love, who has never once asked me to be anyone other than who I am, and who married me twice, and who is, as I record this, in the next room, arguing gently with Pickle about a shoe. I want to say a few things to anyone who is watching this, because they are somewhere on a road like the one I have described. I want to say that you do not have to know everything about yourself right now. You do not have to have the right words. You do not have to be certain. Certainty is a destination, not a requirement for the journey. I want to say that hiding is exhausting, and that the exhaustion is not a personality flaw, it is a signal, and signals are meant to be listened to. I want to say that the people who will love you honestly are worth finding, and that finding them sometimes means being brave first, and that being brave first is not the same as being unafraid. I was terrified every step of the way. I am still sometimes terrified. Bravery is what you do while you are afraid, not what you feel instead of fear. I want to say that if the people around you cannot meet you where you are, that is a real grief, and you are allowed to feel it, and you are also allowed to build a new circle of people who can. I want to say that professional help is not a weakness, that medication is not a failure, that crisis lines exist and are answered by real people who want you to be okay, and that reaching out for help is one of the strongest things a human being can do. I want to say that your identity, whatever it turns out to be, is not an inconvenience to the people who truly love you. It is a gift you are giving them, the gift of getting to know the actual you, and the people worth keeping will understand that, in time, even if the time is longer than you want it to be. And I want to say, finally, that this story is only one story. It is my story, and it is not a template, and your story will not look like mine, and that is as it should be. There are as many ways to arrive at yourself as there are selves to arrive at. Some people know when they are 3, and some people know when they are 60, and some people never arrive at a single answer, and instead arrive at a life that is comfortable with the questions. And all of these are valid. What matters is that you keep listening to the small, honest voice inside you, the one that has been there since you were a child, the one that knew something the world was not ready to tell you. That voice is not your enemy. That voice is the most loyal friend you will ever have. It waited for me for 32 years, and it never gave up, and when I finally opened the door of that small internal room, it did not scold me for taking so long. It just took my hand, and it walked me out into the light, and it has been walking with me ever since. Thank you for watching and spending this time with me. If this story helped you understand yourself or others a little better, feel free to explore more on the channel.